On this day in history, back in the year 1977, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s killer is recaptured following his escape just days earlier from Brushy Mountain State Prison in Tennessee. James Earl Ray was less than 10 years into a 99-year prison sentence for the murder of the Nobel Prize-winning civil rights icon. Escaping from prison wasn't anything new for Ray, who had done it several times before King's assassination. One of those attempts included hiding inside a bread truck to trick the guards at the Missouri State Pen, where he was doing 20 years for robbery. Other attempts took place at the same prison as his most infamous escape would, exactly 46 years ago. As the New York Times reported in the immediate aftermath, quote, in May 1971, Mr. Ray left a dummy in his cell bunk at Brushy Mountain, hacked through a bar, broke fan blades, and crawled into a ventilation tunnel. He reached the prison yard behind his cell block, removed a manhole cover from a steam tunnel, and tried to crawl through the tunnel. But it was 400 degrees inside, and he quickly came back out. Guards alerted by the noise of the escape were waiting for him. That escape attempt was believed to have been planned for several months by Mr. Ray and his cellmate, Roy Morlock, who was serving a life term as a habitual criminal. Guards found a hacksaw, a crowbar, and 3 chisels in the steam tunnel. On February 5, 1972, Mr. Ray crawled from his work area with a makeshift hacksaw in hand and was trying to saw a hole through the ceiling of a room to reach the roof when guards found him, end quote. So who was James Earl Ray? He was a drifter who had grown up impoverished, stealing lunch money from other kids, dropping out of high school, getting kicked out of the army, and as local reports say, he didn't make much of a better criminal either. He once got arrested for burglary in East Alton because he left his shoes at the scene of the crime, and during another incident, he tumbled out of his getaway car during a tight turn. But despite all this, or because of such a resume of crime, he was a good escape artist, though he wasn't good at staying escaped, as you might have realized with those earlier examples. So on June 10th of 1977, Ray and 6 other inmates secretly fastened a homemade ladder made out of wire, which they used to climb over the maximum security prison's walls just before 7 p.m. local time that night. A massive manhunt was launched immediately. 2 of the inmates were apprehended by state troopers right away. But it would take a few more days to capture James Earl Ray, who immediately topped the FBI's most wanted list. It wasn't until bloodhounds Sandy and Little Red were put on the case that they were able to sniff out Ray. And here's how local outlet Knox News describes that moment. Quote, anyone else might have walked right by in the dark. The bloodhounds knew better. Sandy, the lead dog, and partner Little Red led their handlers straight up the craggy hillside to the man who lay burrowed under the half-rotten leaves with only his head and hands protruding. The dog stopped, a shotgun cocked. The man didn't move. He barely breathed. Are you hurt? One guard called out. No, said James Earl Ray, soaked with sweat and covered in mud after 54 hours on the run. I'm okay. Those words spelled the end of the biggest manhunt in East Tennessee history, end quote. The fugitive assassin was brought back into custody, where he would remain until his death in 1998 from complications due to kidney disease and liver failure associated with infection by hepatitis C. Despite having pled guilty to the murder of Dr. King, Ray spent the rest of his life denying it, claiming to have been set up, something which many members of the King and Scott families have been sympathetic to. And that's not to say that Ray didn't pull the trigger. We all know criminals love to lie and to play weak in order to gain sympathy, and so they closely analyze facial expressions and verbal reactions to see if what they're saying lands. And if it does with their target audience, then they lean into that persona. So acknowledging those concerns, is there still any reason to believe that perhaps parts of what Ray was saying might actually be true, that he wasn't acting alone, and that perhaps he became the patsy for a much larger plot? To that point, I want to read again some excerpts from the cousin of Dr. King's widow, Coretta Scott King, Seneca Scott, who wrote an interesting article for Compact magazine this year. In part, he writes, quote, 3 days after his sentencing, Ray fired his attorney, Percy Foreman, and said he'd been pressured into pleading guilty. From the beginning, Coretta was among those who accepted Ray's claims to have been a patsy, and she made regular visits to him in prison. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or HSCA, investigated the King assassination and concluded that Ray had carried out the killing as part of a plot to collect a bounty from 2 St. Louis racists.